Alright everyone, we are continuing with our talk about gross anatomy of bone. So again, the endosteum, this is going to line the medullary cavity, which is where our yellow bone marrow is located for fat storage. This is where we are growing bone, repairing it, and remodeling it in the case of injury. The periosteum covers the outside surface of bone. It's going to have vessels, nerves for both blood and lymphatic vessels, and then it is again that attachment point for tendons and ligaments. And then the articular cartilage at the end of bones is where we are going to have those joints. This helps reduce friction, which produces a lot of heat and can cause some pain, and then it also helps act as a shock absorber. So this articular cartilage is made out of hyaline cartilage, and so this is a really important part of our bone, and it does slowly deteriorate as we get older, which is why a lot of elderly people have a lot of pain in their joints, because this cartilage is not functioning as well as it should, and so that can create some problems. Alright, so a little bit closer look into the endosteum and periosteum here. So that periosteum, again, is that layer on the outside of bone, so it is made out of both a fibrous and cellular layer of tissue. And so those are each going to have slightly different functions. That fibrous layer is where we're having a lot of that connection with tendons and ligaments, and then that cellular layer is where we have those vessels and nerves coming through, and is the part that is assisting with bone repair and remodeling and stuff like that, as well as that endosteum. We'll talk a little bit more about osteocytes and lacuna in another video later on, but that is what is forming that compact bone. And then the endosteum, again, this is the internal part of these long bones, and so this is a bunch of cells surrounding that medullary cavity, where we have all of these different types of bone cells: osteoclasts, osteocytes, and osteoblasts, as well as our osteogenic cells. These are stem cells for bone tissue, and then we have our actual bony matrix in there. And so that's just kind of a little bit closer look at those different structures. And so that endosteum is supplying a lot of these cell types for this internal bony tissue, that bony matrix. All right, so talking a little bit more about gross anatomy of bones. In this case, we are going to talk about flat bones instead of long bones. So flat bones have a layer of spongy bone. This is called dipole, and these are going to be lined on either side by a layer of compact bone. So it's basically like a bone sandwich, where the bread is compact bone, and then the meat or veggies or whatever it is the spongy bone in between those two layers. And so these two layers together work to protect certain internal organs. This is what the bones of our skull are made out of, is flat bones. There's a couple others in our body, like the sternum, but most of the time this is where we find them, is in the skull. And so we still have that periosteum on the outside of this bone, functioning to serve as an attachment point for other connective tissues, as well as helping with remodeling and repair and growth of these bones. And then you can see these layers of that compact bone sandwiching that layer of spongy bone in between them. Alright, so let's get into bone markings. And so again, we're not going to talk a ton about bone markings because we've covered a lot of this in lab, so I don't want to go into a significant amount of detail with it in lecture, but I do want to touch on this still. So bone markings are surface features that can vary super considerably depending on where they're found, both on the bone and within the body. We have three general classes of bone markings. Articulations, this is where two bone surfaces are going to come together, forming joints. projections. This is some part of the bone that's going to project or be raised above the surface of the bone. These are frequently attachment points for tendons and ligaments. And then a hole in the bone. This is an opening or groove that allows blood vessels and nerves to pass through the bone or enter the actual bone itself. So we've seen a lot of examples of different bone markings in the lab over the last few weeks, but again, head of bones is that smooth rounded projection. That's part of what's forming an articulation, those joints. So head of the femur is going to help form part of the hip joint. The head of the humerus will help form part of the shoulder joint, so on and so forth. Tubercles and the trochanters on the femur, these are those larger rough projections, those bumps that are attachment points for tendons and ligaments. And then we'd have that sulcus on the humerus there. This is going to have vessels and nerves running through it, so kind of keeps them from getting squished too much. If they were to just be laying flat against bone surface, it gives them a little recessed area to sit. Tuberosities, like that deltoid tuberosity, again, that roughened area attachment point for tendons and ligaments. In this case, that deltoid tuberosity is an attachment point for the tendon that connects the deltoid muscle to the humerus. The epicondyles also fall into those projection areas, all that kind of stuff. Crests or fossa, those are elevations or depressions. So we've got that iliac fossa there on the coxal bone in the hip region, and then we've got some other fossa in other bones. There can also be openings inside of bones, so we'll talk more about these for the second lab exam material in lab. We'll learn some of the sinuses in the skull bones. There's a lot that we're not going to learn, but we're going to touch on the main ones. But those are openings that instead of going through a bone, like the obturator foramen up here in the coxal bone, these are cavities within bones. These are going to be spaces for air. So we'll talk more about those next week after our first lab exam wraps up and we start on the bones of the skull. Alright, so here is just a table summarizing a bunch of different types of bone markings. So as you can see, there's a lot of different types and terms for a lot of these. So depending on, again, the function and where they're located, both on a bone and within the body, that's going to change the names a little bit, but a lot of times the function is the same. So like tubercles, tuberosities, trochanters, epicondyles, those are all going to be rough surfaces that are going to be attachment points for tendons and ligaments. Alright, so again, I don't want to take up too much time talking about this in lecture since we've seen a lot of these in lab, but you should be familiar with just kind of these general classifications of different bone markings and what their functions are. Alright, because we'll talk a little bit more about function for this lecture material rather than just identifying the different structures like we do in lab. And we will continue talking about bone cells and tissue in our next video.